What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and it's been a while since we covered an indie comic, so we're gonna cover one here. This is called The Trouble with Love, and it's by a friend of mine, Victor Dandridge, and it's drawn by a guy named Harold Edge, who I've never met. But the thing here is that this is a Kickstarter, and as those of you guys who have been around the channel long enough, you know, I never cover Kickstarters unless it's someone that I actually know and that I'm for the most part friends with. There's the occasional exception, but very rarely does that ever happen. Now, The Trouble with Love, this is one of the things I love about this comic. The whole thing takes place in a room, and this is only the first issue, right? I love comics like this. Like in DC Comics, the fight between the Flash, Barry Allen, and Reverse Flash, which takes place in the amount of time it takes for a waitress to drop a cup of coffee and for it to hit the ground. And like that split second, they have this crazy long drawn out fight. I think it's like a cup of coffee, but what this does here is this opens up with basically the Superman of this story, a guy named Apex Prime. And the thing here is that he kind of has this bit of an opening statement where he talks about how he's had all kinds of enemies over the course of his life. He's fought people from a wide array of different walks of life. And he says, but there's one enemy that he's never been able to beat, no matter how hard he tried. And that enemy is love. And that's what's so crazy about it, because he's kind of given to us as this guy that almost kind of has this cynical perception of love itself. And he says, the trouble with love is you cannot punch it in the face. Now, the person he's talking to is his son, John, who literally has a gun pulled on him and is about to help this guy finish with all his living, right? He's sitting there smoking a pipe. His son's about to make it his last one. But the thing about this is he literally kind of talks his son down for a minute, but his son is coming to this from a place of like anger and wrath over what his father did. And the reality here is that his father abandoned the family. Literally Superman, right? This Superman type character abandoned his family. And it's not one of these things where he had to like take off to fight some enemy out in space and like duty called and anything like that. It was never anything like that. In fact, it's way more human. And that's one of the things that I love about this is the story as it progresses, because I want to say Victor is a good chunk into like the whole story itself, right? There's more to it than just this. But the nature of this guy, you do get to see his powers on display and all that kind of stuff, but it's such a visceral and human type of story that it's amazing, right? So like the thing about this is that his son kind of lashes out. Now, context clues, you can obviously tell this is gonna have some adult themes in it, right? Some adult language. We're gonna censor all that stuff out, you know, because we try to keep it kid friendly here as best we can. We've been doing a terrible job of it recently. But the thing here is that his son literally refers to basically Apex Prime's new girl in using some choice words, right? And that's when Apex Prime kind of freaks out and says, look, you can talk to me however you want to, but you cannot talk about her in that way. And he says, I don't know what to tell you that will make you forgive me, right? I don't know what to tell you that will put you in a place where you will understand why I did what I did. But the best thing that I can do is just explain it to you. Now, this is where the human element comes into play, because what you're gonna see over the course of this is that despite all these crazy powers that this guy has, super strength, super speed, he calls it blazer vision, but it's basically heat vision, but where he has like all these different powers, at the end of the day, he's just like you and me and anybody else, right? Human beings, we are hypocritical and we're chaotic and we're messy. And in a lot of ways, even just within the confines of like the realm of superheroes, Superman himself and various heroes who had kind of been modeled after the concept are almost kind of placed in this sort of holier than thou ethereal role, right? Where there's somehow everything that we could ever aspire and hope to be. And even the nature and like his form and function of Superman is that way. This guy is kind of the opposite, right? I mean, he does what superheroes do, right? He's going off on this mission with this crazy science thing that's going nuts and stuff's about to blow up and it's gonna wipe out a town, you know, and all that kind of stuff, and just doing the superhero thing of like stepping in and doing what he's supposed to do, right? Saving the day. But in the midst of all of this, as he's kind of leaving, moving away from the whole thing, he ends up coming across a woman who flashes a smile at him. The two of them have a couple words and that's it. Now, that's the funny thing here, right? Because for those of you guys who are younger, right, who are younger and you haven't quite experienced the world yet, people will tell you that love is an emotional thing. And to a degree, it kind of is. But the reality here is there's a big difference between like love and infatuation. Infatuation is an emotional response. Love is a choice. And that where initially Apex Prime just kind of saw this girl flashing a smile towards him and just kind of pushing it out of his head and focusing on superhero antics, the reality is he just couldn't get this girl out of his head. He goes home to his wife, he goes home to his family, but he can't let this girl go. Now, the funny thing here is, initially, again, he kind of dismisses it, but he sort of introduces this idea of fate. Now, you can interpret this in a couple of different ways, right? It's like the 2023 definition of what we call human nature, right? It's just the stuff that we don't want to deal with, right? Like, well, you know, it's human nature, guys. If only there was something we could do about it, right? You know, but we can't. But the reality here is that even within the confines of this whole situation, he kind of bounces back and forth between this idea of, I couldn't get this girl out of my head. It was just something about her, right? At any point in time, he could have just said no. He could have just stopped it and just said, nope, that's it, done, gone. That's never gonna happen, right? It's a choice that he made to lean into it. And he kind of pushes it into the responsibility of fate, right? Kind of absolving himself of his perspective and simply saying, well, you know, she kept popping up. It was fate, man. It was fate, right? We were meant to be together, right? And so kind of justifying his actions by almost sort of blaming this concept that's so far beyond the realm of human understanding that it just kind of moves in mysterious ways and we're all bound to it and governed by it. And so it just kind of puts him in a situation where it's like, there's nothing I could do, right? And so what ends up happening is that where she initially meets him and then he just flies off, right? Where she shows up as because it turns out she's a cop. She shows up, she gets his attention and he just takes off. That could have been the end of it. Instead, he goes back to her, right? And he says, look, I owe you a apology for how I responded before. And he even says, I had to know what I was running from, right? Like being a hero. I've encountered extraordinary circumstances and influential powers before, but it wasn't. It was real as you or I in this room. And it was mutual. She was infatuated with him. He was infatuated with her. And even he says, I can't, right? I have a family, I have a wife, and I can't do this. And so he says, maybe I was naive to think we could just be that, but I wanted to try, if only to keep her in my life, but I should have known better. And so even when he gets back home after spending the day with Angie, his wife's just kind of like, hey, you're finally home. How was everything? You know, kind of falling asleep in the process. He's like, yeah, you know, there was a stampede in Central Africa and, you know, a village almost got, you know, destroyed. She's like, oh, that's nice. And then just kind of falls asleep. But one of the things to know is it's not as though his wife was neglectful, right? It's not like it was one of these things where she was only there for the good times and the good times and like that was it. She was really a dutiful wife. You know, she was there for him in every way that seemingly a wife would be. And so him taking this approach, the reality here is that if we want to kind of reduce this down to simplified terms of good guys and bad guys, then sure, he's the bad guy here. But what this all really points to is the general gist that as people, we are chaotic, hypocritical, messy. But what he tells his son is, I loved your mother very deeply for so long. She was my best friend, my confidant. I thought she'd be the only person on earth I could be completely honest with about who I am and what I do. Never in a million years did I think someone else would be that for me, but there she was. Again, the whole thing here is, it's not my fault. I mean, it kind of is because I guess maybe I could have said no, but I didn't say no because some power greater than myself was kind of pulling the strings here, right? And so he says between the two of them, they were having these very close and personal, intimate conversations. It started off small, right? The two of them exercising together, spending time together, talking together, right? But he says that level of honesty breeds intimacy, sudden and intense. Having like these genuine and true and personal conversations with someone else, you have to be able to put up this kind of artificial barrier. In your mind, you have to be able to say, sure, I'm having a personal conversation with this person, but they could be anybody, right? And I have to view it that way. They are not my partner, right? They don't see my partner or see me the way my partner does. I don't see them the way I see my partner, and this is a choice that I make. The thing about this is that the more time they spend together and the more time they socialize together, the more that he begins to fall more and more in love with her, to the point that they actually end up sleeping together. And he says, I had grown so used to living a double life that creating this third one came easy. He says, we didn't call ourselves anything. Angie hated thinking about being the quote-unquote other woman, and I wasn't so keen on it either. We accepted the way things were because we were happy being together at all. But I do know her one regret was not meeting you. Now, this is kind of the irony of the whole situation, is because it's not necessarily Apex painting this picture that like Angie is some kind of a victim here, but again, it really is him saying, I mean, I guess on some level I was responsible, but you know, if we're talking about percentages here, I was like 10% responsible. Fate was responsible for the other 90, right? Like that kind of a thing, right? The justifications that we as humans use to make make the decisions that we make. And the response of his son is to actually lash out, right? To reject him, right? He even says, oh, boo-hoo, she didn't get to meet her boyfriend's kid. Am I supposed to feel sorry for her now? I don't. And he says, I was just a kid. Even I could tell that something was wrong. I didn't know or understand it, but I could feel it, and so could mom. And the reality here is that while their marriage wasn't like full of arguing and fighting and things were falling apart, it was that feeling. And anybody who's been in a relationship and felt things falling apart knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's the feeling that like the foundation is kind of starting to crumble a little bit, right? The person is just sort of slowly drifting away. The conversations don't feel as intimate as they used to. You don't hold hands the same way you used to. When you kiss, it doesn't feel the same way. When you're intimate together, things just feel a little off, almost as if they're there, but they're not there at the same time. And so when you had John kind of looking at his mom and seeing her in such a vulnerable and devastated state, the response of Apex is, you're right, John, I should have seen it, but I didn't. I couldn't. I'm human, super or not. I'm just a human being, and I was in love, truly in love. No amount of vision, x-ray, or otherwise could have seen through that. Not then, not yet. And that's when it all hit the fan. Because a man of his stature, in his position, is always being watched, right? He's like a celebrity out there, right? You have celebrities, and then you have the paparazzi who were trying to make some semblance of a living by taking pictures of other people. Now, and as soon as he's out there with Angie, he kisses her, they're intimate together, the photos get shot, it goes onto the front page, and that's how his wife learns. His wife learns that he was cheating on her from tabloid magazines. But the reality here is that with him being out there and being photographed and cheating on his girl, he literally grabs Angie and just kind of whisks away. And what he says is, from the moment that photo was taken, the clock was ticking. Would I get to her first? Would one of my enemies get to her first? And he even goes out publicly and says she's been moved to a safe location for her own safety. And he says, being with me cost her everything, her job, her family. I had a responsibility to her, right? So not only was he stepping out on his family, she was stepping out on hers. And then John kind of comes back with the other half of the story and says, look, I mean, if what you want to do here is play the victim, and you want to feel bad, and you want me to feel bad, and you want me to look at you as a person who was somehow caught up by the hand of fate, and if only there was something that you could have done, if only you could have punched a little harder, or flown a little faster, or your heat vision was a little bit hotter, that maybe you could have somehow avoided all this, that's not going to happen. Because all you had to do was just say no, and that would have been it. This is really you excusing your behavior by trying to use some justification that no one can contend with, right? No one can contest. And he says, heroes protect people. And for all your talk of protection, you hurt two people who should have mattered the most. I had to witness the mess you made. I had to watch my mother reliving the announcement of the failure of her marriage as it was replayed on national television over and over and over again. You weren't even decent enough to give her a heads-up phone call. You just disappeared. Literally, as soon as the affair became public knowledge, Apex was just gone. Like, he just took off. Angie was his main focal point, and that was seemingly it. But in fact, it wasn't necessarily that way, right? Like, John asked, like, why was she so much more important than us? Why'd you save her and leave me and mom behind? And he says, it was a lot more complicated than that, right? Like, I understand your perspective, I really do, but you don't understand mine. And so one of the things that Apex says is that when his wife found out about the affair, he went to go see her, and she literally lost it, right? She lashed out at him and said, don't ever come back here. You don't come back here, you never see our son, that's never going to happen again, right? You are out of our lives forever. You've made your choice. And that was it. And so the thing about this is that when he says, you know, well, your mother gave me no choice, the response of his son is predictable here. How on one hand do you justify your action of saying, well, I had no choice when it came to this whole situation with Angie because fate was pulling the strings, and then on the other hand, use the same justification with the fact that you abandoned us, that you never called her, you never told her, you couldn't have even sat down with her and said, look, I found somebody else, I want to see where this goes, right? Like, how do you use these justifications? You are, by all standards of measurement, the least responsible person ever, right? It's that kind of a thing, right? His response, he even lashes out at his father and then attacks him because John has the same powers as his father. And so he says, yes, I lied to your mother about me having an affair, but I lied to her again when I said that I would stop seeing you. The reality here is I would always stop in to check on you. When you were playing your Little League games, I was up in the sky watching you. I was keeping an eye on that. And the response response of John is, I mean, I could hear your heartbeat, like I kind of figured you were there, but it's one of these things where it's like, yes, I did a terrible thing, but like, you know, I mean, I tried to make up for it, right? But there are some things in this world that we do that cannot be made up for. There's no way that you can do enough right to balance out the scales. It doesn't work that way. But the other part of this is the fate of his ex-wife, because what ends up happening is John tells him with everything that happened and her watching her life fall apart in the blink of an eye and having to live it over and over again on national television, she took herself out, right? She overdosed, and that was it. You drove my mother to end her life. You did that. She never would have done that had you not done what you did. Now, that's the beauty of this whole thing, because over the course of the other stories that Victor's going to cover, not everything is what it seemed. It's the perspective of a child. And one of the things to know, and you really know this if you're somebody my age and you live in nostalgia, just because you remember things being a certain way doesn't mean they were that way. It just means you remember it being that way, right? And so once Apex learns about this, then it's just kind of like, okay, I gotta bring my son into the fold. Right now, the other thing that he reveals here is that Apex has basically had a kid, right? He had a second kid. And so it's one of these things where he kind of invites him in. Now, the funny thing about this is that John is very reluctant to all of this, right? And he says, because when his mom OD'd, he wasn't even there when it happened, right? That there were so many times when she was just on the edge and John was able to bring her back. He was able to talk her down. But the thing about this is that in this instance, when she was at her lowest moment, he was out saving some truck driver who'd fallen asleep behind the wheel. And he says, I was out doing superhero things. I never told her that because what I didn't want her to know is that there was some part of you that was still within me. I didn't want her to know that I had your powers, that I was a walking, talking mirror copy of you. I hated you that much, and I knew how much it would destroy her, or at least destroy what little she had left going for her if I told her that. But in that moment, when I was doing what you would do, she ended up dying. So in a lot of ways, John kind of interprets this as really just kind of looking at his dad and saying, everything you are, everything you stand for leads to nothing but death and loss, right? You are literally just death incarnate. You bring nothing but sadness and misery to people around you. Now, a lot of this is just anger, and a lot of this is just rage, and that's really where it all hits, because Apex looks at his son and says, John, you do realize killing me will not bring your mother back, right? You know that. And the response of John is yes. And that's really the crux of all of this. It's the first time that John has confronted his father, one, since the death of his mom, and two, since he developed any semblance of power, right? Where he feels as if he's man enough to be able to confront his father on this level. But at the really the core of all of this, right? At the center of all of this is just sadness and pain, right? It is a child crying out to his father, wanting to know, why did you destroy our family? Why did you wipe out everything that you claim to love? Why would you do this? And that is really the crux of the story's name, The Trouble with Love. Because as beautiful and wonderful as love is, and while it can bring you to the highest places imaginable, take you to levels of exuberation and thrill that you never thought you'd ever experience, it can bring you to the lowest lows, to lows that you didn't even know existed, right? But at the end of all of this, because of what John is struggling with, basically Apex says, be a part of the family. There's nothing else for you out there now, right? Be my son. I will teach you to become a superhero. Be a part of our family. Meet your sister. And so John ultimately agrees and decides to come back the next morning for breakfast. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. If you guys enjoyed it, this story is phenomenal, The Trouble with Love, and it only gets better. It only ever gets better. So we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.